So wider implications of Brexit. So something also that you need to consider is the European Union has about 40 trade agreements with what's called third countries, so countries outside the European Union, and that's 74 countries in those 40 agreements. So in other words, if you're exporting from anywhere in the European Union, you benefit from an EU trade agreement. Now, those trade agreements are with countries like South Korea in 2007, Canada more recently, Japan, which is going to be the largest trade agreement, the EU-Japan, when it comes into force later this year, Norway, so the EFTA countries, the European Free Trade Association, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Turkey, Algeria, Morocco, Chile, Colombia, not the United States, not China, not India currently, not Brazil, for example. But other trade agreements have been negotiated with the likes of Indonesia, the Mercosur trading bloc, which is Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina and Paraguay. Now there is obviously it has come out a little bit recently. Will those trade agreements automatically roll over? Clearly we would want that if the UK leaves the European Union, which means that we can benefit. So for example, the food and drink sector can benefit from exports to South Korea, for example, because if it rolls over, everything is exactly the same. Now that is a couple of assumptions. One, the European Union are happy for it to roll over, perhaps more importantly, the country's happy for it to roll over. And we've had positive noises. South Korea, Switzerland, we've had positive noises. But I think Switzerland is the only one that's really being called up at the moment. But there are other things that could happen. So the New Zealand Prime Minister was in London on Monday saying, we've got a great opportunity for a trade agreement with New Zealand. The UK government issued consultation papers last year for 4 trade agreements, which they asked businesses to contribute to. One was the United States, one was Australia, another one New Zealand, the other one was TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which takes in a lot of the Asian countries, Chile, Canada as well. So again, the theory is, and one of the opportunities, if we had a hard Brexit in theory, is the UK negotiates trade agreements, comprehensive trade agreements with outside the European Union. But clearly businesses would like these trade agreements to roll over. So in terms of your planning, you do need to consider where you're selling to and are any of these 74 countries. Now some of these trade agreements are comprehensive trade agreements. So South Korea, Canada are comprehensive trade agreements. Some are more association agreements. So possibly like Colombia, for example, is more an association agreement. So it's not a full trade agreement there. In the planning we're going to look at after the break, I've given you the web link, which you can actually see who these trade agreements are with, what they are and where the status is and what's being negotiated as well. So what you can do is look at any of these and say, oh actually I'm exporting to South Korea, I'm exporting to Mexico or South Africa. What does this mean for my business as well? So at least you're aware of it in terms of possible impacts as well, if these agreements do not roll over or the UK is not quickly able to sign a trade agreement there. Work has taken place on trade agreements from the UK government. It's certainly fair to say there's been lots of negotiations. It does take time to negotiate a trade agreement. The EU and Canada took 7 years. To be fair though, the European Union, you had 28 member states negotiating. The UK's just got 1. So in theory, if there's a will, it's potentially possible there. Does trading beyond the EU? So free trade agreements. So basically the concept of free trade agreements is they cover reduced or zero import tariffs. Fantastic, that really helps there. But they also look at non-tariff barriers as well, things like packaging, labelling. So the idea is to reduce the barriers to export, which can be non-tariff, like packaging, labelling, for example. They also look at services. They look at intellectual property protection as well, and trade in services. So it's not just trade in goods, it's trade in services. So increasingly they look at more GDPR exchanges, they look at more and more these trade agreements, not just trade in goods. Okay. Fine for time. Okay. And sorry, that's your web link for the EU trade agreements. So if you click on that, obviously I think you'll get the slides are made available to you. You'll be able to see that link. I just want to mention at this stage, before we look at planning, before we look at the break in about 15 minutes, around origin of goods. Now, some of you may have mentioned this, or you mentioned it certainly in terms of certificate of origin. Now, currently, when you export outside the European Union, businesses require a EC, European Community Certificate of Origin. And that basically means that roughly around 60% of your goods must be of EC, European Union origin. Now, that doesn't matter if the goods are manufactured or come from Poland, from Romania, from Estonia, from Scotland, from Ireland, doesn't matter at all. They have to be of EC origin. And the origin is required to take advantage of the trade agreement. So if we look at South Korea as our example, if it's zero duty on imported goods into South Korea, it's based on production of an EC certificate of origin. It's required by Korean customs. If they don't get that, they apply duty at WTO rates to the goods. If the UK, or once the UK leaves the European Union, we will have to replace the EC certificate of origin with a UK certificate of origin. And that UK certificate of origin will have to be 60%, if we're able to roll over the trade agreements, will have to be 60% UK origin. So if some of your goods rely on European ingredients and European supply chains, that may create an issue. And that 60% is based on value add. So if you're importing goods and adding value to it, and obviously increasing your cost price, you can take that into account. So if, for example, you're importing 50% of the goods from Italy, or 50% of the value of the goods, if you increase the cost price during the production process, that could possibly reduce it to under 40% there. So effectively, this could be an issue for some companies. And I think food and drink, the bakery sector, for example, those products that rely on butter, for example, from overseas, yarn in textiles. So there are examples there, manufacturing possibly for some sectors as well, where that could be an issue. So consequently, some companies have got to consider their supply chains and where they're importing from, and can they hit, in the case of a hard Brexit, this 60% threshold. So is that clear? Anyone got any questions on that at all?
Is there a distinction there between the actual physical product and the packaging of it? I'm thinking of like a really ornate bottle of whiskey, like if it was a fancy decanter from Italy or something, and cheap whiskey. If you are creating that decanter and adding value in what you're selling at, then that is part of your UK origin element of it. So that is part of your cost price that you're selling at there. But if you're just importing it and then exporting it out, then your overseas buyer is probably going to see through that potentially and say, well, why am I paying extra for that element, just because you want it, the UK origin requirement. Now, this also has an impact as well with the European Union, not just South Korea, not just these other 74 agreements. This also has an impact. If the UK signs a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, let's say it's zero tariffs, we all want that, but let's just say it is, and it's a possibility, it's a realistic possibility. If a company cannot make that UK certificate of origin requirement, they will have to pay duties instead. So it is going to have an impact potentially in some sectors there. And if we as a nation, let's say the withdrawal agreement political declaration gets approved, and we enter this transition period, at the end of the transition period, if we have the comprehensive free trade agreement and we don't have the customs union, we will still have this issue of the UK certificate of origin. That's not going to go away. A comprehensive free trade agreement the issue of tariffs and quotas will probably go away. But if you don't meet the origin requirements, that issue is going to be there. And you've still got to make your if we leave the customs union, you've got to make your customs declarations. Now, in the packs in front of you, I've given you a slide or information on a European trade journey. Now, the idea of that is to show you a movement, what a movement is currently. Now, I appreciate for different companies,
or most of your companies, if you're trading goods, your freight forwarder will obviously move the goods on your behalf. They might move them through a local port, Grangemouth, Felixstowe, Dover, but obviously they will move the goods. Currently we have free circulation. So the goods move. We effectively just need a movement certificate. You don't need certificates of origin. You don't need inspection conformity certificates, for example, for Europe. If we leave with a hard border, you have to make those customs declarations. And HMRC have sent letters to the companies impacted saying this is what you've got to do. Goods will also be subject to more inspections as well. And unfortunately, the products that tend to get inspected the most are food and drink and life sciences healthcare products as well. They are subject to the most inspections. Now, after the break, we're going to talk a bit more about authorised economic operator and that's role in possibly reducing inspections. The idea of that is to show the different movements in the trade journey and the fact that customs declarations will be required not just in the United Kingdom or whatever port, but in Europe as well. So we will look at, in the trade journey, who is responsible for those declarations, a wonderful international trade term called Incoterms we'll refer to, and who is responsible for that and what is the impact of that. We'll look at that after the break, because that is an important part of your contingency planning. Also wanted to mention something which has just come up a bit as well around border inspection posts, BIPs. It's a bit unclear the situation. In Ireland only has one border inspection post, so animal products or anything that derives from animal products, which includes milk and eggs, has to be, if you're a third country outside the European Union, has to be inspected at a border inspection post. And Europe doesn't have huge amounts of border inspection posts on the UK facing side. Rotterdam and Zeebrugge, I think, are the main inspection posts. Calais and Boulogne, I believe, do not have border inspection posts. It could be that the EU will have to desperately try and set one up quickly. Ireland only has one in Dublin. So again, another reason to speak to your freight forwarder if you're dealing in animal products, not just live animals, anything, if you like, that comes from an animal, so to speak, is defined that requires to go through a border inspection post. And to see, are they looking at diverting in some way to make sure that it gets to the current border inspection post, the main ones being at Rotterdam especially and Zeebrugge, or Dublin in the case of Southern Ireland. So again, speaking to your freight forwarder has to be one of your key actions for a number of reasons. That's one reason, but also can your freight forwarder make declarations for you? Are they prepared? Have they got the capacity as well? So if you deal with a couple of freight forwarders, obviously have the conversation with a couple of freight forwarders, logistics companies as well. Okay. So operating under WTO rules, we've sort of talked about there. So if the UK leaves under hard Brexit, the UK has to publish its trade tariffs. The UK has published its high-level trade policy for the WTO, and that's been agreed on second reading. On first reading, it was rejected by 6 countries, including the United States. It was agreed by all of Europe. They voted in favour. And Argentina. Argentina because of beef there. So clearly when the UK publishes its trade tariffs, if it publishes 0, that will raise an interesting debate at the WTO. And clearly those countries will have a say on that. New Zealand, Argentina, for example, Canada will have a say on whether they will vote for or vote against. And discussions will have to take place with those countries to obviously get them to agree to the UK's published tariff. So if you...
Do you think that's likely?
I think with some countries, I'm sure, I'm sorry, don't quote me on this, I think the likes of Canada and New Zealand, you thought a pragmatic approach would take place. Other countries, obviously, if they feel that their meat industry or dairy industry is going to be affected, will obviously have to have some discussion with. Those discussions, I'm sure.
Do you think it's likely that we will go for 0 tariffs?
It's probably unlikely, I would have thought. It's going to be harder to get through the WTO, first of all. I guess so there is some discussions, and certainly some members of Parliament would like us to do that. But clearly it would be good for business. But I'm sure discussions and consideration is taking place, and it has been raised by some Conservative ministers that that's what they'd like to do. But we shall see.